November 12, 1943. A cramped office in the Bendler block, Berlin. The building at 76 Tietzufer housed the nerve center of German Army intelligence operations, where two of the WWII's most accomplished analysts were about to confront a truth that would shatter every assumption the German High Command held about their enemy. Colonel Reinhard Galen, head of Foreign Armies East, sat across from his counterpart, Colonel Alexis von Rorona, who led Foreign Armies West. Both men had reached their positions through demonstrated analytical brilliance and meticulous attention to detail. Both had spent years tracking enemy capabilities with professional precision, and both were now staring at documents that represented something far more devastating than any battlefield. Between them lay a stack of papers that appeared unremarkable, standard American military logistics reports captured during recent operations in Italy. The forms were bureaucratic, mundane, even filled with columns of numbers recording supplies delivered, consumed and requisitioned. Nothing about their appearance suggested they contained information that would prove the mathematical impossibility of German victory. Yet the numbers they contained represented an industrial reality so overwhelming that both officers had spent the previous week cross-referencing sources, checking calculations, and searching desperately for errors that would make the figures less apocalyptic. Von Rona's hands trembled slightly as he pushed the top document across the desk. It was a simple supply requisition form from the American Fifth Army in Italy, listing monthly delivery targets for a single American corps operating in the Italian theatre. The form was stamped, dated, signed by multiple logistics officers, clearly authentic. Galen studied the figures in silence, his face growing pale as he absorbed their implications. The Americans were delivering more ammunition to one corps in 1 month than the entire Wehrmacht received on the Eastern Front during the same period. He looked up at von Rona, searching his colleague's face for some indication. This was error or deception. Von Rona's expression offered no comfort. He had already worked through the same calculations, reached the same conclusions, and spent 3 sleepless nights hoping he was wrong. "This cannot be accurate," Galen said quietly, though his tone carried no conviction. He was not stating a belief, but expressing a wish, the desperate hope that reality might somehow be less terrible than the evidence suggested. Von Rona pulled another document from the stack. I thought the same. "This is a fuel delivery report for the same corps covering a single month of operations. They received 3.22 million gall of gasoline and 800,000 gall of diesel." He paused, letting the numbers settle. "I compared this to our own fuel allocations. Army Group Center, with 3 full armies and over 500,000 men, receives less fuel a month than this one American corps." The two men had spent the past week engaged in exactly this kind of comparison, cross-referencing captured American documents with German logistics reports, interrogations with aerial reconnaissance data, agent reports from neutral countries with analysis of captured equipment. of captured equipment. Every source confirmed the same impossible truth. America was not just outproducing Germany. They were operating on a scale that defied comprehension, on a level that made German industrial capacity look medieval by comparison. The numbers told a story that no amount of courage, tactical brilliance, or ideological fervour could overcome. Germany was fighting against arithmetic itself, and arithmetic always wins. The journey to this moment of terrible clarity had begun months earlier, but its roots stretched back years into fundamental miscalculations about American industrial potential. The German intelligence services had tracked Allied industrial capacity since before the war, compiling reports on factory locations, production capabilities, and resource availability. But they had consistently catastrophically underestimated what America could achieve when fully mobilized. This was not mere incompetence. The assumptions built into German strategic thinking, shaped by Nazi racial ideology and Germany's own industrial experience, made American industrial power seem impossible, even fantastical. Germany's own wartime experience coloured everything they believed about industrial production. By 1943, the Reich had mobilized every available resource, stripped occupied territories of raw materials and machinery, implemented slave labour on a massive scale, and pushed its industrial capacity to what seemed like absolute limits. German factories operated around the clock. Workers put in extended shifts. Production of weapons and ammunition had increased dramatically from pre-war levels. Germany was producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates that would have seemed unthinkable in 1939. Yet, despite this total mobilization, despite conquering most of Europe and exploiting its resources, despite the desperate intensification of production under Albert Speer's direction, Germany was losing the material war. The fundamental German miscalculation began before the first shot was fired. In May 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and announced that America would produce 50,000 aircraft annually as part of a massive rearmament program. Over the following months, he expanded this vision. 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping within 2 years. These figures were transmitted to Berlin through multiple intelligence channels. When presented to Hitler and his advisors, the German leadership's response was dismissive, even contemptuous. The numbers were obviously American propaganda, they concluded, designed to intimidate Germany and boost Allied morale. The assessment seemed entirely reasonable based on available data. In 1939, American military aircraft production totaled fewer than 3,000 planes annually. The US Army ranked 18th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. American tanks were obsolete designs, few in number. The US Navy, while substantial, was divided between two oceans and focused on coastal defense rather than power projection. How could a nation with such limited military capacity suddenly increase production 60-fold in just 2 years? It violated every principle of industrial mobilization that German experience had established. Building factories took years. Training workers required months. Developing production techniques demanded extensive trial and error. Roosevelt's proclamation seemed like the fantasy of a desperate politician rather than achievable reality. Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest advisors, reportedly laughed when he heard Roosevelt's announcement. While this account comes from secondary sources rather than contemporary German documents, multiple historians cite Goering stating that Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades and could never produce the military equipment necessary to defeat Germany. Whether the exact quote is accurate, the sentiment it captured was certainly real. German leadership genuinely believed American industrial capacity was unsuited for military production. E's assessment seemed supported by observable facts. America excelled at producing consumer goods, automobiles, household appliances. But military equipment required different expertise, different organizational structures, different engineering approaches. German industry had been preparing for war since 1933. How could American consumer goods manufacturers possibly match German military industrial capacity? The Germans failed to understand something fundamental about American industrial potential that would prove decisive. Of industrial infrastructure across the United States, factories sat empty or underutilized. Millions of skilled workers remained unemployed or underemployed. Machine tools that could produce components for automobiles, tractors, or refrigerators sat idle or operated at reduced capacity. What looked like economic weakness was actually enormous reserve capacity waiting to be activated. When Roosevelt called for military mobilization, he was not asking American industry to build entirely new capability from nothing. He was asking them to convert existing factories, rehire laid-off workers, and redirect machinery that was already built, installed, and proven. The infrastructure for industrial mobilization already existed, requiring only redirection rather than creation. Germany, by contrast, had no such reserve. By 1940, German industry was already operating at near capacity. The Nazi regime had been rearming since 1933, steadily expanding military production year after year. There was little idle capacity to activate, few unemployed skilled workers to rehire, minimal machinery sitting unused. German expansion could only come through building new factories from scratch, conquering territories with existing industrial capacity, or exploiting slave labor. Each of these approaches took the implement and faced inherent limitations. the fundamental difference in starting positions. American unused capacity versus German full utilization meant that America could scale up production far faster than Germany could match, and on a far larger base. The German intelligence services, particularly Foreign Armies West under Colonel von Röhner, had the institutional responsibility for tracking Allied capabilities. Von Röhner came from aristocratic Prussian military lineage. His family had served Germany for generations. He embodied the professional Prussian officer class, methodical, detail-oriented, committed to objective analysis. His organization collected information from multiple sources, including Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, signals, intelligence, from radio intercepts, agent networks operating in neutral countries, systematic interrogation of captured prisoners, and documents captured during military operations. Throughout 1941 and 1942, as America entered the war and began mobilizing, the intelligence picture reaching Berlin remained incomplete and confusing. Reports of American production capacity varied wildly depending on source and method. Some indicated massive increases in output, factories running multiple shifts, tens of thousands of aircraft rolling off assembly lines. Other reports suggested continued economic struggles, labor disputes, inefficient production methods, equipment of inferior quality. The German High Command chose to believe the more comforting assessments, the ones that aligned with their preconceptions about American weakness. This selective acceptance of intelligence was not unique to the Germans. All military organizations tend to favor information confirming existing beliefs over data, challenging core assumptions. But in Germany's case, the cost of this cognitive bias would prove catastrophic. After all, Germany was winning in 1941 and early 1942. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia in 11 days. German forces occupied Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, most of France, significant portions of the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe had proven itself the most formidable air force in the world. German tanks and tactical methods were clearly superior to those of any opponent. German U-boat was sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced, or so Berlin believed. Why should German leadership fear a nation that had not fought a major war since 1918, whose army was tiny, whose tanks were obsolete, whose industrial capacity was oriented toward consumer goods rather than military hardware? This comfortable certainty began developing cracks in North Africa when American forces landed in Operation Torch on November 8, 1942. German commanders expected to face inexperienced troops with inferior equipment who could be quickly defeated and pushed back into the sea. The debriefing teams operating from questionnaires developed by the intelligence services sought to understand not just tactical details of the fighting, but broader patterns of Allied, particularly American military capability. The stories these prisoners told were remarkably consistent across rank, unit, and experience level. Every interrogated prisoner described American supply abundance that seemed wasteful by German standards. They spoke of entire meals being thrown away because soldiers did not like the taste. They described American vehicles being abandoned after minor mechanical problems because it was easier to requisition a new one than repair the old. They recounted seeing supply dumps larger than anything in the German army containing food, ammunition, fuel, equipment in quantities that appeared unlimited. Medical supplies were available in abundance, including sulfur drugs that were increasingly scarce in Germany. Received better food as PW than they had eaten as soldiers. Some accounts seem so extreme that interrogators initially suspected exaggeration or Allied propaganda. But the consistency across hundreds of independent interrogations made dismissal impossible. Officers and enlisted men, paratroopers and infantry, tank crews and artillerymen, all told the same stories of overwhelming American material superiority. More significantly, these accounts matched what German forces were experiencing on other fronts. In Sicily, captured in July and August 1943, German forces encountered similar patterns. In Italy, where Allied forces landed in September 1943, the pattern repeated. Everywhere German forces engaged Americans, they found enemies with seemingly unlimited supplies. These prisoner accounts, while concerning, could theoretically be dismissed as subjective impressions exaggerated by defeated soldiers trying to explain their failure. But then the captured documents began arriving in Berlin in greater numbers, and these could not be dismissed. Unlike P accounts, supply documents were clinical, bureaucratic, undeniable. They were not meant to impress or intimidate. They were simply the routine paperwork of American military logistics, the mundane forms that tracked supplies through the military distribution system. And the numbers they contained were apocalyptic for German strategic planning. One particular document proved especially illuminating, a monthly supply report from an American Army Corps operating in Italy during autumn 1943. The report, stamped and signed by multiple logistics officers, listed deliveries and consumption for the month. The Corps consisted of approximately 80,000 men comparable in size to a German Army Corps, but the comparison ended there. The American Corps had received 3.2 million gallons of gasoline and 800,000 gall of diesel fuel during the month. For the German forces on the Eastern Front, Army Group Center, consisting of multiple corps with several hundred zero men, received less total fuel in a month than this single American corps. The disparity was not marginal. It was a difference of kind rather than degree. The ammunition figures in the same report were even more devastating. The American Corps had received 15,000 tons of artillery ammunition during the month. German Corps received perhaps 2,000 tons during the same period, and that was considered adequate supply. The Americans were firing shells at 7 times the German rate, and crucially, this was sustainable. During 1 month of routine operations, not major battles, just normal activity, the American Corps had received 847 trucks, 127 jeeps, 43 tanks, and 68 artillery pieces as replacements for combat losses and mechanical failures. These were not additions to unit strength. Aircraft production statistics proved even more lopsided and alarming. Germany produced approximately 15,596 military aircraft in 1942, according to the US Strategic Bombing Survey's analysis of captured German records. Each vessel was essentially custom-built with thousands of parts fabricated and assembled by skilled craftsmen. The welding alone for a 10,000-ton ship would take many weeks. Claims of construction times under 6 weeks violated every known principle of ship construction. Colonel Galen, whose responsibilities focused on the Eastern Front, began analyzing American industrial infrastructure through available sources, technical publications, pre-war industrial surveys, open source information from American newspapers and trade journals. The M4 Sherman alone was produced at 11 different facilities operated by automotive companies like Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, and agricultural equipment manufacturers like Allis-Chalmers, and locomotive builders like Baldwin and Limmer. American supply units operated vehicle fleets larger than those available to entire German armies. This disparity in logistics capability had direct and measurable battlefield consequences that German commanders observed with increasing alarm. Some captured documents referenced fuel being used for heating buildings, running electrical generators for non-essential purposes, and fueling vehicles for recreational trips. The waste of fuel for purposes German forces would consider criminally negligent was routine in American operations. It compared German production capacity to Allied output across every significant category of military equipment: tanks, artillery, aircraft, trucks, ships, ammunition, fuel, steel. Every comparison told the same story. He cited historical examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones through skill and determination. Frederick the Great's victories when outnumbered, Hannibal's victories over Rome, Napoleon's early campaign. The May 12, 1944 bombing of the Lohner synthetic oil plant was, in Speer's later words, the day the technological war was decided. He would later state, on that day, it was clear to everyone in German industry that they had lost the war. Quality became irrelevant against overwhelming quantity. The final devastating intelligence came in late 1944. through detailed analysis of Allied logistics operations in France. German plans explicitly depended on capturing American fuel depots to sustain the attack. The Wehrmacht could not supply sufficient fuel through its own logistics system for an offensive of this scale and duration. The Foreign Army's East files he preserved became valuable intelligence assets for the Western Allies. The story of German intelligence analysis during World War II reveals profound truths about modern warfare that remain relevant decades later. It existed in petroleum figures showing American fuel abundance while German forces rationed every drop. It existed in steel production comparisons showing Allied output exceeding German capacity by 5-5-1. Their tragedy was not analytical failure, but the irrelevance of accurate intelligence when leadership refuses to accept reality. The captured supply documents told a story of inevitable defeat written in numbers that could not be argued with or dismissed except through willful blindness.